Have you ever created a boundary and immediately wondered, was that fair? Too harsh? Not harsh enough? Or maybe you were convinced it was a solid boundary, but then looking back, it was more about controlling chaos than protecting your peace? If that's you, you're not alone. Today, we are unpacking what healthy boundaries really look like, especially if you're in a relationship with someone in addiction recovery. We'll also talk about boundaries versus written boundaries. And we'll talk about how to create them with compassion, clarity, and zero guilt. Hi, I'm Laura. Welcome to Bookends of Recovery, the podcast where recovery, healing, hope, and of course you take center stage. You guys already know I love boundaries. It's because I was so bad at them. I mean, really, really bad. And I don't want you guys to be bad at them. So I'm just going to jump in and tell you look, after my husband's disclosure, I realized I didn't understand boundaries at all. I thought I was creating healthy boundaries, but really mine were fear based, and it was really an effort to try to control him, and it just turned into a shitstorm. I don't want you to do that because I was making the choice to stay with my husband, and so my goal ultimately was to walk side by side with him, to connect deeper with him. And so, if that's what you're trying to do, to connect with your loved one, and but still, try to take care of yourself and ultimately, each other, then those boundaries, they are so important. And boundaries are about emotional safety, self respect, staying grounded in your own truth, even when everything around you just feels so uncertain. There really is a difference between all these different boundaries. So let's just dive in to the healthy emotional boundaries first. And then this way, people who aren't interested in written boundaries can be like, okay, I'm out. So here are some of the healthy emotional boundaries that you should come to expect in your relationship, and not just with your partner, but with anybody, really. Well, except when I get to the intimacy part. But you should be treated with dignity and respect. You should have honest and open communication. You should be able to refrain from yelling or just, hurling insults at each other. There should be no lying or manipulation. No more blaming or belittling. And you absolutely have the right to say no. And I'm going to add on to that. You also have a right to say no to intimacy. I know that one of the things that we agreed to was that if I was being triggered, even when we were in the middle of something, I had, obviously I could say no at any time, it's my body, but I had the right to say no without explanation. Because a lot of times when we're triggered and we have trauma, my husband had to understand that I can't put into words how I'm feeling in that moment. Maybe an hour from now, I could put it into context, but in that moment, it's not going to happen. And so he understood that. And so there were times where it would just be like, I can't. We have to stop. And he'd be like, okay. And what I loved most about it was he'd be like, is there anything I can do to help? And oftentimes it was just, no, I just need to stop. And he'd be like, okay, do you want to watch TV? Like, yep. Or let's go watch TV. Let's go watch some Below Deck or whatever. Um, and also, we have the right to speak up, but we need to do that kindly and clearly. And let's be real clear about this. If someone is physically abusive, that is not a boundary issue. That is a safety issue. Please seek help. The U.S. National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-SAFE. 1-800-799-SAFE. So let's talk about some key points in setting boundaries. The first thing you want to do when you are creating these boundaries is you are identifying what you need. So really sit down and take a few moments and think about what makes you feel unsafe, anxious, or just emotionally off balance. This can be anything that's related to communication, excuse me, I'm so sorry, finances, triggers, even things that involve your partner's recovery. For instance, I told my husband I wanted to know, like, what triggers you, what you see or whatever. And so he shared that with me because I asked. Well, now I know. So guess what? His trigger became my trigger. I was like, I'm not going to say it because, I don't want to make it your trigger. But then I would see it, and then I was like, oh no. So then I'd watch him. Is that going to trigger him? You know what I mean? So some things you just don't want to know. But same like with communication. Does it cause you to feel unsafe if your partner slams doors or cabinets or yells? That kind of thing. The next thing is you want to communicate respectfully. So I'm going to do 2 statements, and you'll have to figure out which one is respectful. You need to let me know when you're going to run late. I feel anxious when I don't know where you are, so I need a boundary around regular check-ins. So it's pretty obvious that the I statement has more compassion. You comes off as accusatory. It's like, you did this, you blah blah, right? But when I say I need, can you please, it just sounds better than you. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is be clear. If there's a consequence tied to a boundary, state it clearly. Be plain, right? No guessing games. The idea is we want to be transparent, right? And next, be realistic. Make sure it's something you can and will follow through with. I think I've shared this before, but one of my first terrible consequences was that I take the Wi-Fi router if my husband had a setback. So that's what I did. And it turned out terribly. Like, really bad. It didn't serve either one of us, and it lasted maybe, I don't know, 5 seconds. Because obviously I needed it for work, the kids needed it for homework. It was just unrealistic. And of course, it was fear-based. It had nothing to do with my healing, because I was traumatized. And it was more about coming from a place of fear and control, and not about his recovery, my healing, it was so trauma based. And so it was a bad, bad consequence. Next, you need to be flexible. Your needs are going to evolve, and your boundaries should evolve with it. You may think, oh my gosh, but then if I change anything, it's going to look like I'm weak. No, it's not weakness. This is growth, and that is such a good thing. It's not being inconsistent, it's not weak, it's growth, and that is a beautiful thing. When I think it, we're talking over a decade ago, so I can't really, maybe we were 2 months out. My husband came up to me and asked me if I would mind if he got on YouTube. And I was like, oh no, not YouTube. Oh no. And I was like, why? Because he had put YouTube in his inner circle. If you're not familiar with that, it's the three circles. I have a podcast on it and a blog on it. And I said, oh, what's it for? And so he was like, oh, I got to do a repair on the truck. I don't know what, blah, blah, blah. Of course, I tuned out by then, a truck repair. And so I said, okay. But, thinking about it, I was like, number one, he told me what it was for, and he let me know it was on YouTube. He could have just snuck around. I wouldn't have known. So that's progress in and of itself. And he was the one that put YouTube in his inner circle to begin with. Like, I had no idea about it. So these are all signs of progress. Again, that's growth. And so me being flexible on it, where I wasn't even the one that put it in there. So these are all growth things, if that makes sense. And of course, the next thing is please prioritize your self care. I want you to take a moment and repeat after me. Self care isn't selfish. Whether you are the one in recovery or the one that is healing, self care isn't selfish. You're carrying a lot emotionally, mentally, physically. This is a lot. Please make sure that you are nurturing yourself throughout this process. Okay, so whether you are the person that is the partner or whether you are the person in recovery, I think you can benefit from, to listen to this part. This is about the written boundary agreement. I get it. A lot of people are like, nope, not for me. That's fine. But you can still kind of listen and see if maybe it's something you want to reflect over. So as you explore the boundaries, well, I guess before I can explain why. The reason a lot of people are like, no, not written, I'll explain why I chose to do it. Like I said, tangible is my thing. I like things because my world was so chaotic. I chose to have a written boundary agreement because I was getting relational trauma, relational PTSD. So I was having nightmares. I was having mind movies, anxiety, depression, like all the things. And so when I was having all the panic attacks and I needed something I could touch, that I could, read and remind myself that my husband and I were walking beside one another, healing together, walking in recovery together, doing the concept of us together, with the three recoveries, his, mine, and ours. And that piece of paper was like just something physical that I could see and be like, okay, I got this. He's committed. I'm committed. Okay. And that's pretty much what it represented. So it was not a forever thing, it was for the moment. So as you explore the boundaries, take a moment to pause and reflect. What do you need to feel safe, respected, and emotionally supported? And again, if a boundary agreement feels right for your situation, here's how to make it intentional and empowering, not rigid or reactionary, because it is a temporary thing. You need to be able to move away from it and let it go. So you're going to want to be able to grab a notebook, a pen, something non-alcoholic, because you want to be clear-headed. And then, ground yourself with a few deep breaths to get centered. And start with some common sense boundaries like the ones we've talked about. And these are just things that sound basic but protect your peace. So, again, we talk about things like, you know, the being late, or I need you to read the article our counselor suggested. It helps me feel understood, that kind of thing. You can consider consequences if that's something that you want to include. You do not have to include consequences if that's not your jam. But remember, consequences are not punishments. They're ways to safeguard your emotional well-being. So some examples. People always ask, what are good examples of consequences? I want to underline this. These are just examples. You do what works for you. So skipping a date night if you're emotionally drained, it doesn't mean you have to go because you guys planned to go out to dinner that night. If you're emotionally drained and, something happened, perhaps they said they were going to do something and then they didn't, and you're like, this was part of something that was in our boundary agreement, and I don't feel like going. I'm exhausted, and this was part of the consequence. So we're not going out tonight. Or you need a night alone to process your feelings, or that person needs to sleep in another room, or whatever. Uh, and then you need to establish you don't need, you can establish non-negotiables. These are boundaries you won't bend on. So, for example, for me, I have, because my husband had online affairs, so if my husband cheats again, I will leave. That is a boundary that protects my self-respect. If there is a setback and he hides it, um, we sleep in separate rooms. And I need transparency to rebuild trust. And if he tells me about a setback, well, there's no consequence because honesty changes everything. And so just, take your time and write it out. So what you can do is think about your boundaries and your action plan. So what can you accept in your relationship? What are your emotional limits? What behaviors cross the line? Do you want to be involved in their setbacks, or do you want to be kept out of that information loop? Maybe they have an accountability partner that is better suited for that information. Will knowing the details help or make your anxiety worse? You need to decide what's healthy for you. what consequences or actions can you realistically enforce? You know, as an example, removing the router, not great. So, is it a night in separate rooms? A temporary boundary around intimacy? Remember, that's something to be careful about. We're not using sex as a weapon. We're talking about I can't be intimate with you because I would be forcing it. That's not saying I'm not going to have sex with you because no, I do not feel intimacy in this moment. Um, or do you need to take a pause in conversation until things cool down? That is an extremely healthy boundary. Just make sure you go back to the conversation when you're ready. Stick to what you can actually follow through with and not what sounds or looks good on paper. Consistency builds trust, even if a boundary is hard to hold. I can tell you from experience, it was really difficult to keep boundaries in check. There was a post that my husband did back when Kendeo was around, and he talked about being like a wild horse and how being, just uh, running free, and then all of a sudden these boundaries were now put in place, and he felt like he was being tamed, and he hated it. And then he realized, but it was for the good. And after a while, he was like, this is a good thing that I needed. And then he had more respect and more love and everything else. And I was like, oh. So I know it sounds silly and ridiculous, but that's what he thought. And then he shared that with others in his group, and they were like, yeah, that makes total sense. Because they were all running wild, and they were like, yeah, we get it. Like, we're just like all going buck wild, but they needed to be tamed. Not getting their balls cut off, just tamed. So so yeah, but it was me just having resolve and sticking with, what I could and not giving in. Because he did. When I started putting boundaries in place and sticking with them, it actually did get worse before it got better. But it was worth it. So just remember, boundaries aren't about pushing someone away. They're about keeping yourself rooted in what matters the most: safety, honesty, and your emotional well being. You know, they say, I respect myself too much to stay stuck in chaos. Um, isn't that such a great saying? Or I can care about your recovery, but not carry it for you. Right? And then there's another one. I have a right to feel safe, seen, and steady. Cool. So those are the ones I'm going to leave you with. So whether you're navigating from a fresh disclosure or years into healing, boundaries are your anchor. They don't just protect the relationship, they protect you. If this episode resonated with you, head over to bookendsofrecovery.com. You will find free downloadable worksheets, one on this particular uh, podcast. I'm probably just going to put the worksheet up straight to the worksheet um, page. And you'll also find like blog posts on relational trauma and all that stuff. So feel free to reach out whether you are the one struggling or you are the partner. And let's stay connected. You can find me over at Facebook at Bookends of Recovery. for weekly encouragement updates and real talk on recovery and healing. If you have any questions, just please let me know. Thank you so much for staying tuned.